poetry is taught, the institutions that publish poetry and get it to us, you know, these institutions have changed a bit, and that makes a difference. So if you think about the universities that women couldn't have attended, that people of color, working class people, you know, for the most part didn't attend except in very small numbers, and what happened in those classrooms, and which poets were taught, and how did students respond to them, and how did that whole conversation happen with regard to who sort of stays seemingly important and who passes. Social institutions have changed because of social movements, and so that moves things forward, in my opinion, a little bit. And that means I think we just get to shine a light on more people, but I imagine that the numbers of people making their poems is in some ways relatively constant.
Just wonder how many of the people on this list went to college because of the GI Bill, speaking of change.
Questions?
Do you want us each to answer every question?
No, you don't have to.
I mean, I would say that there's, first of all, the sun's going to blow up, so none of this matters at some level.
Yeah. In the long run, we're all dead.
But I also think that prizes work because there's a scarcity of recognition. And as long as there's a scarcity of recognition, there'll be prizes. If we want to recognize everything, which is certainly Whitman's dream of a representative a straight democracy, not a representative one, then maybe we would have a different kind of prize. But that's not the way this country works, and it's not the way the book industry works.
The scarcity of recognition, and Susan, you've written about this, and Alan Grossman has written about it. The scarcity of recognition is existential as well as commercial and economic. There's only so much attention you have in your life to give to anything in the moments that you are alive.
Can we talk about the most recent winners? Jean Valentine, W.S. Merwin, Nathaniel Mackey, Robert Hass, Mark Doty, Keith Waldrop, Terrence Hayes, and whether there's anything common about them. And again, I'm struck by this, the dichotomy that's played out between the body and thinking, as all of you have been talking about poetry and its different relationships with the body and with thinking. Do these poets, these most recent winners, have anything in common? Are they all thinkers? Are they feelers? Where do they stand in that spectrum? Is there a spectrum? There doesn't have to be. You can feel and think at the same time. Isn't that the whole point of poetry? Feel at the same time.
Well, that's a dangerous question. I think that I think to some degree that that as culture, as the culture of award giving and as the consciousness of various inequities, has grown, and as there are more poets and poetry has become aesthetically more tribal, that it seems to me that there's a kind of rotation system entering a lot of different prize giving institutions. So I think some of those recent names are a consequence of that. Now, there were always power systems in place, of course, in the prize giving, and I acknowledge that, but I still feel like I still feel like the criterias are it may be a romantic myth that I'm carrying, but I still feel like poetic value is perceptible by virtue of what it brings us existentially, and that includes beauty, of course, and rawness and rationality and learnedness and erudition and all those other things. But so that's my short answer. I won't go any deeper than that.
One thing, I mean, and this might be slightly orthogonal to your question, Katie, but when I got the list, I was, I both did and didn't want to think about the list, right? I partly wanted to follow Leslie Shipman's prompt to think about post-1950 poetry, and how does it sit in me, how does it sit in people I talk to or things I read. And so one comparandum I was thinking about was the Norton Anthology and the successive editions of it. And one of the things that's very striking is, what is it? Is it Jahan Ramazani's double-barreled Norton Anthology of Modern and Contemporary Poetry, which came out, I think, in 2005, maybe 2003. And that's a fascinating redrawing of the past 50 years. And so poets you would have had to have been initiated into, let's call it a schoolroom, who never would have been, eaten by the Norton maw, were suddenly there. For example, the so-called language poets were suddenly represented. And they started looking much more, sociable with, say, Robert Lowell. And I think that there's something about that. This is where I become a kind of, genial and perhaps, myopic agnostic. I sort of feel like things, and I also really appreciate Elizabeth's, I see it as a kind of counter-genealogical move. I feel like there are so many things that I had to be, and still hope to be, initiated into. And part of it is, how does that happen? How do you encounter things? How are you introduced to things and shepherded? And sometimes you can be shepherded by very polemically strange anthologies, sometimes anthologies that are, fully sanctified by the Norton name. That became a more elastic anthology in the past 10 years, I think tells us something. It doesn't tell us something about the decadence of taste. It tells us something about a new capaciousness. And it might not be, a capaciousness that will last for 30 years, and there will be resortings. But one wants to, I always want to know about the Johnsons and the Aldingtons, and I also think of John Ashbery's book, Other Traditions. This sense of these supposedly minor poets, you don't know who's going to beam down in your brain and your heart in a powerful way in advance. And so so one gets into all these kinds of categories, major and minor. Greatness is not a category that I tend to traffic in much. But, I do think, and it's always with ambivalence that I invoke Ezra Pound, but he's an endlessly useful critical resource when he says, damn your taste, I want to sharpen your perceptions, after which your taste can take care of itself. And for me, I've had to have a lot of exposure to things to be able to perceive. Okay, what I thought was, the bee's knees when I was 20, is some of which I still do and some of which I don't. And I also had to learn how to read certain things. And I feel it's also the case that I have drunk the poetry Kool-Aid. Like, I am in it. This is doing another kind of cultural work, right? This is about sending signals. Sometimes I feel that these things are about not reading, right? There are words that tell you just have to know about it and not read it. And I wonder about that too, So at any rate, just some free-floating responses.
That makes me want to ask you whether or not capaciousness is more always more, Yeah. Is capaciousness ever... I'm not even just saying that because it can be frustrating and then you have to read everything. I'm saying that because does a lineage, does the description of a lineage, not just by prizes but by institutions, do more than aid the reader? It actually crafts, a taste that can be useful. Are there times in which that capaciousness just feels more like the bad part of going into the supermarket and seeing 10 different kinds of pasta sauce or something? It's a terrible analogy.
When we make choices, we take responsibility for what we think has value and what doesn't have value. We all do that individually. The National Book Award does that, and so in that sense, not to choose, what we think has value is to forsake that responsibility, and we do it for ourselves, and we do it for anybody who might be listening or paying attention to the list. So. In that sense, the list is important, and all of our lists are important in that sense because, like you, Maureen, I change my mind, and my taste is surprised and re-educated.
Speaking of anybody who might be paying attention, I think it's time to take some questions from the audience. If you have some there, mics set up. You can just shout. Raise your hand.
Come on stage, whatever.
And I'll try to select you from your capaciousness. The man in the blue shirt.
I'm interested in the fact that with a poetry award, you could have, like with John Crowe Ransom, the selected poems, and then you could have, like Diving into the Wreck, a very individual work on a poet's progress. And it's very different from fiction, where you don't have the collected oeuvre of John Updike up against Thomas Pynchon.
You do have collected short stories.
You have collected short stories is the closest thing. So I'm interested in a way, it's apples and oranges in any given year. If a John Crowe Ransom, who has a very commanding but slim volume of selected, is against, an Alan Dugan, an Adrian Rich, somebody who, copiously produces over a career. So I'd be interested in comments on that.
I can say something about that because I wanted to emphasize individual books in my presentation, partly because I think one fact I gleaned that was a surprise to me about the NBA is that it is a prize that's given many more awards to collected and selected poems, I'd say, than other national prizes. And I was recently on the jury of a major national prize, and one of the jurors felt that it wasn't appropriate to give the prize to collected poems if the individual books in that collection had not already won the prize. Now, that would be really some collected poems. So it's a strange reasoning, and I think it's really good that after the early years when the Pulitzer and the National Book Award, for example, overlapped a great deal and seemed to be just repeating themselves or switching off, that the NBA did take on this identity that recognized poetic careers and still had room for individual books.
I liked the fact when I read the list that William Stafford won it, I think, in 1963, and John Crowe Ransom won it for selected poems the next year. And I kind of think that kind of erratic graph of what good poetry is spoke well of the award, because they're so different.
Hello. I noticed that this is the National Book Foundation, and we're talking about the Book Award, but the history of American poetry is not necessarily limited to published books of poetry. And so I'm wondering how you guys deal with, or maybe what organization is there to award or recognize other forms of poetry, especially, like Maureen, you mentioned YouTube and hip-hop music in your haikus, and that is poetry. So how can we incorporate that into this, even if those aren't published in a book form? You know what I'm asking?
I want to say, well, the industry is changing all the time.
This is a serious question. This is a question about a newer and an adjacent or an allied art form to the page-based, printed, you mostly read it silently, poetry that the NBA has gone to. And the question is, should the NBA be awarding performance poetry? And if not, surely something should. It's an art form. And do we know whether there are prominent national awards for performance poets in the way that there are for playwrights and theater pieces? If not, there will be tomorrow. Start one.
I think your question, which is a good one, is part of a bigger question, or it points to something that I think we all need to keep in mind, that no matter what it's doing, which is in some ways a really good thing, awards like this, no matter what they do, are never going to cover all of the territory. No matter how it's designed, there's always going to be really important things that are left out. And I think the thing that's most in danger of being left out is what Tony spoke to really eloquently about 10 minutes ago, about the fact that poems are really, really important to people. That's what really matters about this. What sometimes the culture of awards occludes is that very thing, because we get bound up in the business of recognition rather than the fact of the beauty and necessity of poetry, which is usually a different thing.
I mean, so many of these books are out of print, but that doesn't mean you can't find the poems. The poems are everywhere, right? The woman in the front, in the second row.